Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are moving along in Module 3.3 to natural selection. So now we're really starting to dig into the mechanisms of biology. And again, thinking about biology on this larger level right now, we're thinking in terms of evolutionary biology. So we've sort of shifted now from straight ecology and moving now into evolutionary biology. So to start us off, I found this nice study by Dr. Macias Munoz, sorry, Munoz, and looking at the evolution of phototransduction genes in Lepidoptera. So all this sort of means is we're looking at specific genes in Lepidoptera species, so that includes butterflies, moths, and looking for specific genes that are important for sight and color blind and the ability to see different colors in both Lepidoptera species. So she has this interesting system where she's looking at the genetics that are in one butterfly species and one moth species. And as you know, moths tend to operate at night versus butterflies, which tend to operate during the day. And so what she was looking at is comparing the genomes between these two and seeing if there are specific genes for eyesight that evolved in moths versus butterflies. And you can see that in high light conditions, this gene, the TRP gene, is dramatically amplified in butterflies, which is something you might expect. So in butterflies operate again only during the daylight, and therefore they have these genes that seem to be specific to high light conditions versus moths, which again don't have a lot of expression here because of low light conditions. So these are the type of questions that evolutionary biologists like to think of is, okay, so what genes evolve in which populations and why? And so that's what we're going to be discussing today in our lecture. So in order to understand natural selection, we have to understand how populations evolve and what conditions are necessary in order for populations to evolve. So again, just a reminder, thinking back to our ecology that we had previously, a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live together in the same geographic area. And when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about an entire population can evolve only when some traits are favored over others. And so the example and case study that's given to you in your book is looking at drug resistance. And we're going to dig deeper into that in a little bit, but for now, just keep that in the back of your mind as the case study. Again, in order to understand when evolution can occur, we first need to have genetically diverse populations. So what that means is we have to have populations that express different traits. And then on top of that, we also have to have varying proportions of these genetic makeup. So that's just saying we need to have individuals that express different traits in a population, and there has to be varying proportions of these in a population. Next, we need to have an environmental condition that favors some genetic makeup over another genetic makeup. Only then do we see when changes in the genetic makeup over time, because the environment is favoring a specific genetic makeup, that's when we can have evolution. Again, we need all three of these to be present in order for a population to evolve. So when we're talking about evolution and whether or not a population can evolve, we come across this term called fitness. And fitness for an evolutionary biologist is very different than thinking about in terms of just whether or not an organism is fit. Ultimately, fitness for an evolutionary biologist is saying is the ability for an organism to survive and critically reproduce in a particular environment. It's not enough that a species is able to survive. It's critical that they're able to pass on those genes to the next generation. That's what makes a population fit. So again, higher fitness is an increased likelihood of a genetic makeup being passed down to the next generation. So I'm able to pass on my genes to the next generation. That makes me a higher fit individual. And again, the example that your book gives is looking at the genetic makeup that confers resistance to antibiotics. So if a genetic makeup that confers resistance to antibiotics increases the organism's fitness because they're able to survive in areas where the antibiotic is present. So we can look at this. Again, this is looking at a figure in your book. So when we're looking at an area where there's no antibiotic, we see that all of these populations of bacteria are similar to one another. They don't have any traits that are making them more fit than any other. However, when we add the presence of an antibiotic, we start to see that these green ones are antibiotic-sensitive variants, so they are less likely to survive in this area and thus have low fitness. Conversely, when we see these bacteria are highly antibiotic-resistant variants, their ability to survive in this environment is high, so they have a high fitness. Ultimately, an organism's genetic makeup determines its physical traits. Now, we're going to go into genetics later on in the semester, but right now it's enough to sort of just think of this in terms of having specific genetic makeup and being able to pass that genetic makeup onto your offspring. And again, what we're trying to see when we're evolving is this interplay between physical traits and the environment, and that determines the frequency of these traits in a population. And if a trait improves the fitness, those traits become more common in the population. Let's look at that in an example. And ultimately, that's what a population involves. So let's look at that in an example. Again, we're going to be talking about in the presence of an antibiotic and looking at antibiotic resistance. So in this first population, again, we have those grouping of bacteria that we saw previously, where these green bacteria are very receptive to antibiotics and are likely to die, versus these red ones, which are highly resistant to antibiotics. So in the absence of an antibiotic, we have this grouping of individuals. They're all able to reproduce the same because the environment is not conferring some individuals to survive versus others. So over time, we have the same frequency of genetic makeup, or in this case, alleles is what we're going to call them here. Over time, the frequency of these alleles remains the same. So the frequency of antibiotic resistance remains the same in the absence of an antibiotic. Now that changes dramatically when we change the environment. So now we have an environment where there are antibiotics, and we have sensitive bacterium, moderately sensitive bacterium, and highly resistant bacterium. And over time, the highly resistant bacteria, the ones that are most fit, are going to pass on their genetic makeup. And we're going to see that resistant bacteria reproduce more often and therefore pass on their resistance and their genetic makeup in greater number to the next generations. And over time, the frequency of the genetic makeup, or allele, increases dramatically. So that's what we're looking at when we're thinking about a population evolving. So here we're seeing we have, again, thinking through what is needed for evolution to occur. We have a genetically diverse field. We have an environment which selects for specific genetic makeup. and then that genetic makeup is passed on, and they're able to reproduce in a over the other ones which die out. Again, so this is how we think of populations evolving. It's a little bit funny to sort of think about bacteria as populations, but again, we're not just talking about moose. We're talking about environment influencing a living organism and conferring their ability to survive in those given environments. Okay, we're going to talk more specifically about antibiotic resistance in the next lecture, a little bit more about natural selection. See you soon.